It's a great opportunity for the students to ask you questions. But just before we kick off with the Q&A, I have a question for you myself. So before you came to visit us here in Dublin, you were down in County Cork in Ballymaloo, if I'm right. So am I brave enough to ask, what do you think of A, the relish, and B, rural Ireland?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay, we'll skip over the Ballymaloo relish. Is like quite a famous Irish relish.
Is it?
It is, yeah. I think that's why you were going.
Jesus, I missed that. No, what is it?
It's a raisin-based relish. It goes very well with toast, and it's more middle class than ketchup.
You're quite right, I had it on absolutely everything.
Absolutely everything, that's exactly what we like to hear. So,
and I just thought it was what the students made out of the leftovers.
So that's a no on the relish.
But you're quite right, raisin-based.
Raisin-based, yeah. And what did you think of rural Ireland? How did you and your family find it?
Was that rural or royal?
Rural.
Rural.
We don't have any rurals.
No, I don't have any ours either. Well, the bit that I saw through the rain was wonderful.
Yeah.
It was actually not unlike rural England.
That's good.
If you just show me two pictures, I possibly couldn't have felt the difference. But it was very nice, and what was particularly nice was knowing that it wasn't England.
Okay, so I'm going to throw it straight out to the floor if anyone would like to kick us off with a question. The brave first hand. Yeah.
I don't know anything about photography, so if you want to know about your f-stops, I'm not the man.
Who had the best reaction you ever had to a negative review you'd given of their work or their food?
The best reaction to a negative review?
Yeah.
The funniest reaction.
Well, I don't know, but I had a chef who ended up in prison. But I don't think that was entirely to do with my review. I think that just might have been the tipping point. I think he had issues. And he hit, I think, quite a lot of the kitchen staff. And anyway, I once had a man stop me in the street and say, "You owe me £500,000. And so I said, "Will you take a check?" And he said, "You ruined a perfectly decent business." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me which of the many, many perfectly decent businesses I've ruined, which was yours." And he did remind me that it was a vegetarian diner, a vegetarian American diner. And I said, I shall go to heaven for that. That's a vegetarian diner. Other than that, no, normally I'm afraid the reaction to bad reviews is as you'd imagine. Which is, it's funny, when people get bad reviews, has anyone in here actually been reviewed or been criticised for anything? I mean, other than tutors telling you you're stupid. I mean, you have almost everybody who is criticised thinks there is something personal in the criticism. Nobody ever says, maybe this was because it was a bad book, or because I made a bad television programme, or because my food's not very good. People always say, he gave us a bad review because he tried to shag one of the waitresses and she turned him down. And everybody has a personal reason for taking criticism, and it's a bizarre thing that people are really. I don't suppose it's a bizarre thing. I mean, I suppose it's an understandable thing, but people are very bad at preparing themselves or using bad criticism. Sorry, that was a long and windy answer.
It's a great answer.
Simple, brilliant question.
Yeah, a lot of your work would be considered quite controversial. Do you think that's fair?
I don't really deal in fair and unfair.
Okay.
Is it understandable? Yes. Do I think it's controversial? Absolutely not. I mean, I think I'm the most milksop, vanilla, straight up, ordinary bloke. And it's just the rest of you that are weird. I mean, I never ever set out to be controversial. And this is the one thing people always say to you, you know, oh, but you do it on purpose, don't you? I mean, you'd rather write a bad review than a good one. You'd rather say something, you know, needly rather than just plain. And I really wouldn't. I just think I am one of those people that was born pointing up the down escalator. I mean, I just don't see things quite the same. I think I see things clearer than the rest of you.
And do you think that's why you're so successful, because you write in a way that others don't?
Not for me to say that I'm successful.
It's for the long term. Yeah.
Well, yes, I'm touched. That's one of the blush-making things about this, is that I don't ever think about success. You treat those two pretenders just the same, triumph and disaster, and I'm very wary of getting too close to thinking that maybe I've cracked it. As my family will tell you, is I'm the worst on Sundays when I'm reading my stuff, and I read it. It's what I turn to every Sunday. The first thing I do is I look at my columns, and it's an agony. I mean, it's agony. You know, there are people in the world in real agony. It's not that sort of agony, but it's uncomfortable. And I've never read one of my articles that I think, gosh, you nailed that. I mean, all of them, they're all things I wish I'd taken more time over, I wish I'd rewritten, I just wish I hadn't said. So I'm very wary of ever thinking, well, that's it, you know. I've got there now.
Yeah.
I can just sit back and be Giles Corral, you know.
Any questions?
Hello, first of all, I'd like to say that I really loved one of your articles, and I'm glad you have your family here, because it was the one about the Disney Cafe at Harrods, if you remember that one.
The Disney Cafe?
It was a review of the Disney Cafe. You went with your kids to the Disney Cafe at Harrods and you didn't have a good time.
Oh, God, did you remember that, Beetle? Edith and Isaac. Yeah, it was dreadful. It was really. Do you know, it's funny because people say, "God, you must love it when you get a really bad place," because you go. And there is a bit of you when it is properly like that, a proper hideous car crash of a mistake. There's a bit of you just goes, "Thank you, God." And I write for an Australian magazine called Australian Gourmet Traveller, which I larkily like to think of as Aussie Tucker Walkabout. Do you know? You see, you laugh when you're Australian. They never laugh. I tell my editor that at least 3 times a year. She never laughs. Anyway, my editor there is a very good food writer, and I often say, "What was the restaurant so and so like?" And he went, "Oh, you know, Adrian, it's the old nightmare of the 14 out of 20." And there is that, if you're writing something that's just sort of all right, is a bit this and a bit that on the other. That is the worst. What you really want is something that's really fantastic, or something that is like the Disney Cafe in Harrods. The two people are completely made for each other. Sorry, was that?
A follow-up to the question.
Yes, go on.
So I remember reading that article a couple of years ago, and I thought it was hilariously scathing. And then before it came to you today, I tried to look at it again. But as you know, the Times website has a subscription service now. So I wanted to ask you, you may not be fully aware of the context of your work, but what do you think about subscription-based digital media? And do you think that has kind of limited the scope of your audience in the past few years, or no real effect?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and that is the biggest question of my business, and I mean, we can either talk a lot about that, or I can be glib and just say something silly and little about it. Because it is in the nature of how you pay for what you read. And I know that there are a lot of journalists I work with really, really hate the paywall. For exactly the reason you've said, is that it limits the people who read them. So if you work for The Guardian, or you work for any of the newspapers that don't have a paywall, you get exponentially many more hits, or eyeballs, or whatever you call them. And I know my friends who are invariably all younger, and invariably all Twitter or tweet, or I'm making that strange stuff, that thing on the phone. Anyway, they do that, and they really mind. I don't mind. I only ever read the media on paper. I read papers. What I got into this business was because I love papers. I do have a tablet thing which I can get the paper on, but I hate it. I hate trying to find stuff on it, and it also looks so sort of. That's me. That's not the media. That's me. It's because I'm old. It's because that's the way I've always worked. Because I like newspapers. Because there is a romance and a gravitas to paper that I don't think there is. I don't find on the internet, but that again is to do with my history and my heritage, and in a generation that will be like someone talking about the Book of Kells. But that's me. So I don't mind. In the end, who do I write for? The absolute truth is, for all journalists, is that we write for editors. In the end, you write for the people who pay you. And so the first person I need to know that what I've written is all right is my editor. So when they go, yeah, that's fine, then I sort of go, phew, that's it, I can forget about it and get off and do the next thing. And up to a point I write for an audience, but I'm not, again, rather like thinking about whether or not I'm good at it, I don't like to think too much about who it is I'm writing for. And I know that there are people who do write and think, I always think of a particular little old lady in Solihull who, or I think of some. I don't have. I remember the first time I ever did when I wrote the first book I wrote, and I did a literary thing in Edinburgh, and I never talked in front of an audience of people before, and as we walked up onto the stage, the girl who was not unlike you, who was interviewing me, said, "We've had a very good house, we've got a full house." And I said, "Oh, how nice." And she said, "They're all your fans." And I said, "Kind of." And I sat down, I walked up, and I looked up over this sea. It was Edinburgh, my hometown. It was a sea of mauve-rinsed old ladies. Little shingle cousins, exactly like my grandmother. And it was then that I realised who it was I'd been writing for all these years. It was people who looked at me and said, "Who's that young man pretending to be A.A. Gill?" And I think I'm aware that my audience, I think, generally splits into two. There are the people who think that I remember the Blitz alongside them, and then there are first year university students. I think by the time they get to be the second year, they realise I'm a bit of a twat. But I think first year, they're all mine.
Stefan, did you have a question?
Sort of to move on to something else. Where's the best place to get a meal in London?
Oh, now there you see. I've never been asked that before. So this answer comes absolutely fresh as a daisy, and it's a question right back at you: who do you want to eat with? You see, what you eat should never be as important as who you're eating with. An old food writer called Glenn Christian, when I first started, who taught me a lot about writing about food, said, if your steak is the star of your dinner, then you're eating with the wrong people. And if I were in London, it would entirely depend on who I was going out with. The place that I would want to go for lunch with an old friend would be different from the place that Nicola and I would go out to for dinner. The place that I would take my mother is not the same place that I would take, if I mixed with lots of rowdy men, which I don't terribly, but if I did, that would be somewhere else. So it really depends. If you want to know where the best place is for you, the best place is for you is the place you go most often. And I write this occasionally, and it should be said more, is that if you want the best food you can get in your city, is find somewhere you can walk to and eat there once a week. And after a bit, you'll find that the food is... That's my mother again. You'll find that the food is incredibly good, or is much better. They'll know who you are. You can get to sit in the same place. The wine list will be familiar to you. They'll be very pleased that you're in. They'll say, we've got those, whatever it is that you really like. That's it. There is nothing as good as being a regular customer. And one of the problems with eating out that's happened since I've been writing about food, which is over 20 years now, is that restaurants have become events. So people will phone me and say, oh, Adrian, can we go out to dinner? And, you know about the stuff you choose. And I'll say, well, why don't we go to X? And they go, oh, no, we've already been there. Like it was the theatre or a cinema or a gig. And it isn't. Food and restaurants are places that you should have relationships with all your life. I mean, there's a place in Barnes, not actually my local, it's about 10 minutes away from where I live, in Barnes in West London, and it's an Italian restaurant called Riva, and it's run by a man called Riva, and I haven't seen a menu for 15 years. And I love him, and I love it, and it's terrific food, and we have our birthdays and our celebrations there, and I sit in the same place, and he talks the same bollocks to me every week. And that's where we go. Is it the greatest Italian restaurant in the world? Well, it is for me. There's your answer.
When you write a review, I guess you want to be truthful and entertaining. I'll just pursue that. Is there anything else you want to do with your reviews?
It's a very interesting question about the nature of criticism and what criticism is for. I noticed that I wrote, I'm going to step back a little from your question, is that you're right, that those are the two things you want to be. You want to be entertaining and you want to be truthful, and my primary job, my first job, is to sell newspapers. So that's what I want to do. I wrote a piece today about, I've just read it, and in it I've mentioned, yesterday, Sunday, I mentioned the first film I ever went to was a Disney film, again, called Old Yeller. I must have been about 4 or 5, and Old Yeller is a Disney movie about a boy and his dog, and it's a typical, hey young critter, come down, one of those Disney films about young boys and animals. And it's very sweet, and it's very cute, and it's very heartwarming, until the end, which the big denouement at the end is that the wolf attacks the family, and the dog goes out and defends the family and kills the wolf. And then the father shoots the dog. And he shoots the dog because the wolf had rabies. Now, for a 5-year-old, it was the most traumatizing thing I'd ever seen. I'd never ever seen a story that ended unhappily. I'd never been told a story that ended unhappily. I couldn't imagine that stories could end unhappily. And what I knew about this story was that in this film there came a point where somebody had taken a decision and said, we can either let the dog be a bit injured and then get better and go on and play with the boy who's his best friend, and that will be the end. Or we can get someone to put a bullet in the dog's head. What do you think? Let's kill the dog. And I knew it was a decision, an artistic decision, that had been made to upset children. And I couldn't believe that an adult would do that. Why would you do? Why do you want to make me feel like that? And that's still I think, the most profound, fundamental question of all criticism is, why do you want to make me feel like this? What is it, whatever you're doing, whether you're making television programs, I started off as an art critic, I do theatre criticism, I write book reviews, and sometimes I stand in for Jeremy and do motor cars. Doesn't really apply for motor cars, but it applies for everything else. Is you have to ask, what was the intention of the person who made this pasta, wrote this book, made this television program? Why do they want me to feel like this? And that is, I think, the fundamental nature of criticism. And the basis of criticism is not having an opinion. It's not simply having a preference. There was a very good example recently of something that was pretending to be criticism, or thought it was criticism but wasn't, which was a Guardian art critic, wrote about the sea of poppies that had been planted outside the Tower of London, which will be one poppy for every casualty, every British and Commonwealth casualty in the Great War. And he said he hated that it was sentimental, and that what he would rather see would be the moat filled with bones and barbed wire. And that what he liked better than this sentimentalized view of the Great War was Otto Dix's marvelous etching of a skull with worms coming out of it. And you go, well, that's fair enough. That's an unarguable preference. And if culture were a menu, you could order that. You could say, I don't want the poppies, but I'll have the skull with the maggots. That isn't criticism. That isn't asking. The fundamental question is, what do you want me to feel, and why? Just saying, I would like it to be something else, is absurd. It's like saying, why can't I do dubstep to Beethoven? It's going into a Chinese restaurant and saying, give me a pizza. So that's what I try to do twice a week in the paper. I try to ask things why it is they are what they are and what they're trying to say. And if it's a sausage, it's quite a difficult question.
What advice would you give to people who want to go into journalism as a career?
Oh, I see the really instant and sad, awful answer is don't. But I'm not going to say that because actually I'm very... I know how to turn this thing on. You do that. You know that. Is that journalists and journalism have had... One of the reasons I'm very thrilled to be given this is because we've had collectively, as a profession, we're not really a profession, as a trade. Andreas Whittam Smith said, we're not a profession, we're a trade. And that's what we're tradesmen. And as a trade, we've had a very bad couple of years. We've had a lot of the scandals, which you'll know about. But we also had an enormous amount of journalists have been laid off and are now working. There are now people I work with who are working what they get paid per work, are now working for less money than I got when I started working on Tatler 25 years ago. It's becoming a hyphenated profession, where people are a journalist hyphen something else, and what they usually are something else is a PR. So you're normally doing some straight journalism, and the rest of the time you're writing or helping somebody sell something. And there are obvious, huge problems with that. There are obvious conflicts. And I'm not saying that there aren't conflicts all the time in all of journalism, but that's a terrible sadness. Not least because it means that journalism is also becoming a much more middle-class business. Is that the only people who can afford to be journalists in the early days are people whose families will support them, or have their rent paid, or have some private means of paying for themselves. And it is in the nature of the business that lots and lots of people want to do it. So there are always more people who want to do it than there are jobs. And you know, the liberal capitalism we were talking about says that if there are more people than there are jobs, then the price of you pay for the job will sink until people won't do it anymore. The problem with that is that it means you get an awful lot of very bad journalism and very second-rate journalism. And in the end, what you end up with is citizen journalism. And how's that working out for you all? I mean, citizen journalism is no journalism at all. Is actually somebody who just happened to see a car crash and take a picture. And that was the most pernicious misuse of the hard fought for freedom of the press that we've had in recent years. Is a lot of people who really should have known better. A lot of incredibly liberal, decent, thoughtful, right-on people saying it's all about citizen journalism. And it all really isn't. And what's happened I think over the last 5 years, when we've had a huge amount of people writing blogs, people writing for nothing, people who you know nothing about writing for nothing, people anonymously tweeting, what's happened is it has made what I do more valuable. So I'm all for that. But it means that in the end, people who can do what I do well and are brands that I don't think of myself remotely as a brand, but as a name that you recognize. If you read a restaurant review written by me and you see A.A. Gill, the chances are you may have read another one by A.A. Gill. And you know a bit about A.A. Gill. You know that he's a bit of a wanker about this, but he's strong about that, and he cares about this, and he never writes about that. And if you've read a lot more, you'll know that he's an alcoholic, and therefore he doesn't drink, therefore there's no point in looking for what he thinks about the wine list. There are all of those things you know about. If you look for the citizen journalists on TripAdvisor, all you get, probably, is somebody who's been employed by Four Seasons to write up their hotel. So my answer to you is, how do you get into journalism? If you're keen, as quickly as possible, because we really need people who are really committed to being proper, good, what I would call newspaper journalists, not blog journalists and not citizens journalists, not journalists for nothing. But it's really, really important, and it's more important now than it ever was. You know, there's a million voices out there. Most of them are barking. And if you can write clearly and honestly, and you're informed and you care, then you will sound like an angel amongst dogs.
Thank you.
Sure.
You're a very recognisable as well as well-recognised journalist. So when you were making a booking for a restaurant, do you use your own name? And then when you turn up, does the maitre d' faint or do
Quickly, yes, no, I never use my own name. I usually either Nicola, who's sitting at the back, who's the blonde, who she will make a reservation, or often my office at the paper will make a reservation, and I try not to use my own phone because PRs get to know your phone number and it comes out. Anyway, so I don't. And we have a couple of names that we use. I could tell you, but obviously I'd have to kill you. And in the office they also make up names. And there was a time when I had an editor who just thought it was terribly funny to make me go and turn up at restaurants as the one I went most often was Mr. Al Qaeda. We got a good table. And so anyway, no, I go as me, and some restaurants recognise me, and many don't. And Nicola is always much better at knowing when we've been made than I am. And she'll say, oh, well, they know you're in. And the first thing that happens, invariably, is that everything gets worse. And what usually happens is a waiter will recognise me, and you get to know waiters around London, and a waiter will go to the pass, which is where the food comes through, where the chef is, and he'll go, does that reviewer, restaurant bloke in? And the chef will go, who? Where? And he'll go, oh shit. It's what's he on, table 7? And then you'll go, what's table 7 having? And they'll go, the monkfish and the lamb. Who's doing the monkfish? Do it again! And you get this great long pause between your first course and your next course while they do it all again. And then people start coming up and saying, is everything all right? And is anyone in catering here? Does anyone work? I mean, not just as I'm sure everyone's had to be a waiter or waitress. Anyway, if you ever find yourself in catering, the first lesson about catering is never ever go up to a customer and say, is everything all right? It instantly makes them a liar. It's the worst possible question. Because usually it isn't, frankly. I mean, there's always something that isn't right. So you then have to make a decision about, am I going to tell them the thing that isn't right? And therefore get into a 10-minute, well, we've never had anyone else complain, and it's funny you should say that, and, it was fresh in today, and it's a very good supplier, and, well, if you want, do you want something else, can we make you another thing, And by that time, she's never going to say yes to you anyway. So you don't want to have that conversation. So you go, no, everything's fine, and you've lied. And this bloody waiter has made you a liar. You came out for dinner and now, you've got to answer to God. What you should say is there anything else I can get you? And that's fine. That you can just get a no, we're fine. Or you can say, yes, you can get me another main course because this is disgusting. So that's what happens. And I suppose the implication in your question is it different? Do I get different, so do I get different food? I do remember once sitting in a restaurant having a rather mediocre 14 out of 20 meal, and a bloke who was leaving was putting on his coat, and he saw me, and he came and he walked past me, and he looked over my shoulder, a very big guy, and he looked over my shoulder like that, and he went, I had that. You got one more potato than I got. Yes, sometimes things are more effortfully made. But I have been doing this a long time. I do notice, and mostly what I'm always doing in restaurants is I'm looking at what everyone else is eating, and how they are enjoying it, what they're getting, who they are. So I mean, you can't change the whole restaurant. I remember we were out a couple of years ago. Nicola looked around the restaurant and said, have you noticed anything? And I went, what? She said, it's packed. And she went, no, we're the only people eating. They'd stopped everybody else's food so that we could have ours. Pretty much everybody else was waiting, watching us eat.
Any other questions, guys?
Are there any articles or reviews you wrote that you look back and you regret?
You regret. Again, a question I often get asked, and I always get asked it with that tone of voice, which is slightly biblical. There's a touch of the confessional in there. Is there anything you'd like to get off your chest? And the answer is straightforward: no. I've never regretted anything, in the sense that I've never written anything that I later thought I shouldn't have written. I think there are things that I've written that the consequences have been I could have done without. But that's a bit like, it's a bit like saying, well, I shouldn't have gone out wearing a short skirt. You know, I mean, that's not my fault. So there were things that caused furores, but I think they were the fault of the people who caused the furore, not me.
And the ones you're particularly proud of?
I'm not really proud of anything. There are things there are stories, there's one or two that I'm glad I was able to write, and we haven't talked about it, but there's another sort of section of stuff that I write, which is intermittent, but is foreign stories, and they tend to be from hard places and about hard subjects, and I parlay whatever success I have as a critic and a feature writer to get the paper to allow me to go and do stories that I think are important. I mean, I'm not saying that restaurants aren't important, but there's a league of importance and they're not in the first division. And sometimes those stories I'm pleased that I was able to do, and I'm pleased that I've got into a position where I can sell a story. It's actually funny enough, that's one of the things that's about being a journalist. That's getting harder. I mean, 8 or 9 years ago, I could go to an editor and just say, I really want to go to Chad. And the editor would go, oh yeah, just go. Great. I mean, and would trust me to come back with a story. And now, I have to say, they'll go, well, what's the story? What are you going to get? What's it going to be about? How are we going to do it? What are the logistics? And my reaction is generally, well, I don't know until I get there. I mean, when I do stories, the foreign stories, I do as little research as possible. I mean, I work in the opposite way of most journalists, is I do no research. I think that for me, if I do research, I end up writing like an I Spy book, and you just tick off what other people have seen. I've got to see this, I've got to notice that, this, and you get clouded with other people's views. Often very good views, but then not mine. I would much rather get everything myself and feel everything as being fresh and new. And then, if I need to know something, I'll go and look it up when I get back. So I don't do research, and I don't ever take notes. I take sometimes very small notes, sometimes people's phone numbers, but I don't write anything down. I mean, I can't write. I mean, the other thing you know about me, if you've read me a lot of this, I really can't write. I'm dyslexic, so I just remember it all. So the things that I was proudest of. Years and years ago, I did a story on sleeping sickness in the north of Uganda, and a horrible disease that was growing, and the only people who had a 20th century cure for it were going to stop making it because they weren't making any money out of it, because people who get sleeping sickness tend to be not people who can pay for sleeping sickness cures. And so I went and wrote a piece about that, and I usually journalists don't write their own headlines, but I remember the headline on this one because I thought it was particularly good, and it was, "I don't know what makes you angry." I came back and I read the story, and I can never get through the story without making myself cry. A friend of mine read the story, and she had a show on CNN, and she took the story and she put it on CNN. And made them make the drugs again. I inherited this thing of being lachrymose from my dad. My dad would cry at everything. And he was really not, you wouldn't know it. I'm like, you wouldn't know it to look at me, but he would. He'd sit in front of the television, crying at commercials. And he'd just go, fuck, fuck, fuck. Anyway, that was, you know, I didn't find the cure for the disease, and I didn't have to pay for it. And it was Christian Amanpour who put it on CNN, and she did. But it was, you got to the end of it and you went, that's what journalism should be. You know, that would be just, if we could do that once a week. So, those are the stories I'm proud of. Yeah, I'll say it.
You speak of kind of harnessing the power of journalism to talk about issues that really matter. What would you feel to be the most important issue that our generation talks about and tackles and writes about?
Oh, good question. Very good question. I think the thing your generation is going to have to come to terms with is not so much, the news stories will go on being what they are. You know, we're in a particularly dreadful year for news stories. I mean, I love newspapers. I read 7 or 8 a day. And even I now pick up the news and go, I don't know if I can do any more of this. I mean, it's a very tough time for hard news, which is a good thing for me, for journalists. But I think the biggest problem you're going to face, and it comes down to the question we were asked earlier, is about the nature of how you get your information and how you get your news and who moderates it. And I think one of the things that we're learning is how incredibly important editing is that editing is more important than writing. It's what there was a great German artist, a Jewish artist just before the war, who said the art of drawing is the art of omission. It's what you leave out that's important. And the truth about the news is what gets left out and what gets put in. It's the editorializing. And what we have with electronic media and with the internet and with all that is that the editing process is handed over to the ants. The editing process is simply the weight of numbers, of clicks, of, retweets. And that's not a way to know about how your world works. Is that you don't have, first of all, you don't have an editing process about who has access to your news. Anybody can tell you anything. Nobody has to be accountable. Nobody has to back up what they say. Nobody has to come from a reputable place for saying it. And then what is left out is all the stuff which is, can't compete with the Kardashians. And that's not a way to know about things. At the moment, there's a terrible famine in Sudan. I've covered 2 famines in Sudan, and I think I might have to go back for a 3rd one. But you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know. Editing is the most important thing. And all of you have to work out a way of editing what it is you take on board, and what you learn, and what you encourage, and where you want to hear it from. And one of the things I think you also must do is not just go to places that confirm your view of life. Too much of the news that comes to us is already preaching to people who are converted. So an awful lot of people become part of groups like, I don't just mean reading left-wing newspapers or right-wing newspapers, but do things like on Mumsnet, for instance, or any of the other masses of pressure groups that are becoming, I don't particularly mean Mumsnet's becoming intolerant, but lots of these places are becoming fantastically intolerant of dissenting views. That there is only one way. I wrote a piece in the New Statesman a couple of weeks ago, a magazine I like, but I remember somebody wrote something in it, and there was a letter the next week saying, I don't buy the New Statesman to read this sort of Tory crap. And you go, well, you should be. Tory crap is exactly what you should be reading. You should be reading all sorts of crap, but you should be reading a vast array of things, and that in itself seems to contradict the editing thing. You want things to be edited for intelligence and for commitment and for believability and for expertise. You don't want them edited for opinion. That's a tall order for you lot.
Okay, hopefully we can say challenge accepted. Anyone else got any questions? We have time for 1 or 2 more. Just take Chris.
What really strikes me every time I read one of your pieces is like the vast array of different ideas you bring to whatever you're writing about. Bringing so many different ideas and think through tremendously creative. I'm wondering how you see creativity, or what's it so in your work?
In my case, it's an inferior feeling of being an autodidact. That I only autodidacts ever use that word about themselves. I didn't go to university. I don't have any qualifications. I don't have any exams. So I have that slight chippy vanity about knowledge. So I never do pub quizzes because, again, I'm too vain, but I would be an ideal pub quiz.
Yeah, so when I mentioned to my mother that you were coming, she had 3 things to say about you. First is, did you know that VA stands for Adrian? The second thing was, he's best friends with Paxman now, so he is. And the third thing, they're a pair of lovable, charming rogues. So how do you feel about being part of the most dynamic duo of charming robes, my mother's words. Yeah.
Well, I think your mother's very generous. Yes, I'm very fond of Jeremy, and I've known him a long time, and he's Beatles' godfather, and I think he's terrific, and he's one of the things about him that would surprise people is that he's an awful lot cleverer than he would like you to know. And we used to write a lot of pieces back to back, which was enormous. Some of the best fun I've ever had as a journalist was we would go and take two sides of the story, which was, I mean, he is properly contrarian. I mean, barking. And I remember once where he had a I thought a rather unpleasant, no, it was not, I thought it was a rather unpleasant English public school boy's view of homosexuality. And I mean, he would never be specifically homophobic, but he was the language and the jokes and the stuff. And in the end I said, Jeremy, you've just got to stop it. It's not funny now, it's not clever, you're too old. And he just said, oh, you want proof. And I said, okay, we're going, our next story, we're going to go to Mykonos. Mykonos has the biggest gay beach in the world. And I said, I'm going to take you to the biggest nude gay beach in the world. So we went off. And we went to Mykonos, and it was very funny, and entertaining. I mean, funny in a not in a mocking way, but in a very funny, jolly seaside way. And after a couple of days, along the S&M end of the nude gay beach, I got quite, not offended, I just got quite put off by the very, very meat-markety business of men muscle building and the body fascism of it. So I was the person who was getting sort of pursed-lipped and a bit Mother Mary about the whole thing. And I, at the end of one evening, and I found Jeremy, of course, sitting at a bar, surrounded by incredibly gay men, having the time of his life. And he said, why have you never brought me here before? This is fantastic! And I said, why? And he said, these are the only group of men in the whole world who don't want to talk to me about motor cars!
Thank you very much for an incredibly entertaining and insightful hour. I think we'd all wish for many, many more, but I guess we can read you next Sunday, so not too long of a wait. So I'll ask you all to stay seated while Claire brings Mr. Gill and his family back up to the council room. But one more round of applause for